Few are inclined to doubt the attribution of the companion volumes of Luke and Acts to a person named Luke. The focus instead by critics is to deny Luke access to the apostolic circle. Not surprisingly, all copies of Luke's Gospel name Luke as the author. Acts itself has no attribution, but other than a few oddballs, it is the overwhelming consensus that Luke is the author, and as well the best candidate among Paul's listed companions to be culled from the traveling group designated by we in Acts. Externally, there's a healthy roster of testimony. Traditionally, Luke has been identified as a physician, and certain aspects of Luke Acts point in that direction. The author of Luke Acts is clearly cultured. His Greek is the best in the New Testament, and he knows Greco-Roman rhetorical techniques. That he had the leisure to write a 2-volume account at least points to a person of independent means, or perhaps a retainer of a well-to-do person. And the author was a person of high sensitivity and empathy. All of this, especially the latter, fits quite well with our picture of Luke as a physician. We should mention one argument that is not useful in this regard. In the past, there were some arguments that Luke's vocabulary reflected the specialized language of a physician, but further analysis has shown that Luke's language is simply that of an educated person of his day, which of course a physician would be. The critical question, though, is not so much who was, but when, and thus whether he was connected to a member of the apostolic circle, namely Paul. If Luke Acts was written early, then a connection to Paul is possible, but if it was written late, the connection to Paul disappears. So, what evidence indicates an earlier date for Luke Acts? The most critical point in favor is the abrupt ending of Acts, with Paul waiting to go to trial at Rome. If Acts was written past the date this would correspond with, circa 62 AD, we would expect to have heard more of Paul's fate, but we don't. And it's difficult to believe, in light of Luke's careful accounting of the martyrdoms of Stephen and James, the brother of John, that Luke would have stopped Acts right there if he had known at that writing of Paul's execution under Nero a few years later. This is pretty strong evidence, so what can be said against it? One objection is that Luke just didn't report Paul's execution because he was trying to keep from making the Romans angry. Yeah, that would make sense, except that he reports... And if he wasn't afraid of that angering the Romans, well, you can make the connection. A more convoluted argument is that it was Luke's literary intention to simply show how the commission to preach the gospel to the ends of the earth was fulfilled, so the arrival and preaching of Paul at Rome is more than a fitting ending for his literary purpose. But this argument can then be taken a step further and defeated. There's also a theme in Acts of the equality of Peter and Paul. If Luke Acts was written after their executions, what better way to demonstrate this than to end with both martyrdoms in Rome? In addition, if Luke's readers knew that Paul had been martyred, then he has ended Acts in the worst possible way for inspiring confidence and commitment in his readers. Ending the work on an upbeat note, when it is known that Paul went on to be executed, is like writing a biography of a soldier who went heroically to war in order to exemplify and encourage patriotism, and omitting the fact that he was killed in action. In turn, what can be said to argue that Luke Acts was written too late for Luke to have been a member of Paul's circle, or to argue that he wasn't part of that circle? As a closeout, I want to briefly discuss a point sometimes used to date Luke Acts after 70 AD, one that shows some scholars sometimes live too long in ivory towers. Under the assumption that Mark wrote his gospel first, much is made of how Luke allegedly changed the emphasis of Mark 13 from the destruction of the temple and the Antichrist figure to the destruction of Jerusalem. But wait a minute. The temple was inside the walls of Jerusalem. If Jesus was predicting the destruction of the temple in Mark, then it logically follows that he must also have predicted the destruction, or at the very least the invasion, of Jerusalem, since an army is not going to peacefully hop over or pass through the walls of Jerusalem and just attack the temple, right? Yeah, I have a lot of respect for most scholars, but some of them need to get out more. See ya.